Good evening, everybody, and welcome to my talk this evening, which will be Italy's Wine Mystique in History and Art. And we'll be tracing the wine mystique of Italy through the centuries. The common grapevine, which was once wild, has been cultivated in all the continents except one, Antarctica. And wine the grapes were first turned into wine probably in about 8,500 BC. Wine threads through the history of ancient peoples prior to the Greeks, the Etruscans, the Italic tribes, the Romans, all of whom cultivated wine in this peninsula. And wine has been endowed in these cultures with strong significances and symbolism. Wine images and symbolism are fortified, of course, with the birth of Christianity, and wine symbolism reigns on into the Middle Ages in the art and history, sculpture, paintings through the Renaissance, from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, through the Baroque period, the Neoclassical period to the present day. Wine has captured the imagination and creative thinking of philosophers, poets, artists, as well as those centering their knowledge on the healing professions throughout the world. Probably the oldest depictions of wine cultivation are to be found in the Egyptian tombs of earlier than 1000 BC. But we're going to center our discussion tonight on the country of Italy, Western Europe, let us say, and particularly the country of Italy. And here in Italy, Etruscan frescoes of the 5th century BC appear in paintings, and these images are depicting the joy of sharing wine. This is from an Etruscan tomb of the Latium area. The name of the town is called Tarquinia. It dates from the 5th century BC, and here we can see the joy of sharing wine. A gentleman has his wine cup, the calyx, and he's encouraging the flute players to join him in festivities. And let us remember that an Etruscan tomb was the home of the deceased. It was many rooms. It was made to look like a house, if you will. The walls were painted with joyous images, with flowers, with vegetation. You can see the vegetation on this wall here, and with scenes of banquets, of festivities, of the sharing with others, because this was going to be their home for eternity, if you will. Who were the Etruscans? Well, this is the area of ancient Etruria, and it is the darker of the olive green colors you see. And this indicates the first settlements of Etruria in 750 BC. On this map, you can see the initials AC, which will mean Avanti Cristo, before Christ. The Etruscans, for years, historians thought and archaeologists thought that they probably came from Anatolia, present-day Turkey. Now theories think they're a people indigenous to this peninsula, maybe migrating down here from the area of the Alps. The Etruscan culture is alive in Italy from about 9000 BC to 1000 BC. By 1000 BC, they're absorbed into the Roman Empire. Now, if you look at this map, you can see the city of Perugia, that is in our region of Umbria. Just about half an inch to the right of that is my town of Assisi. It is not in ancient Etruria. It is in the area of an ancient Italic tribe called the Umbri. The main Etruscan cities of Umbria were Perugia and Orvieto, called Velsna by the Etruscans. Other important Etruscan cities were Cortona, Arezzo, Volterra. And down here along the coast is Tarquinia, the site of these Etruscan tomb paintings. This is another Etruscan tomb painting of Tarquinia, 5th century BC. It's a joyous banquet. The gentleman holding the wine and seeming to pour it could be the deceased represented in this fresco, and he's offering wine to those joining into the banquet. Why was wine ever made in the first place? Probably for medicinal reasons and for medical use. And our oldest documentations about wine are medical documents prescribing the use of wine. They have been found written on clay tablets, which were Sumerian, present day Iraq, of 2200 BC. Those tablets contain prescriptions using wine for healing. Prescriptions about wine for healing were found on papyrus documents in ancient Egyptian tombs. And those papyrus indicate remedies for eradicating asthma, epilepsy, healing depression, and for releasing a baby from the belly of its mama. Wine present as a medicinal use. The oldest doctor known in history is Hippocrates, Greek. He lived in the 4th and 5th century BC. He's depicted here in this lovely fresco, which is in the 13th century church of the cathedral of the Latium town of Anagni. Wonderful to see with its twin sister Alanya, They're just Alatri, pardon me. Alanya is my husband Pino. Anagni and Alatri are just south of Rome, marvelous Romanesque towns. And in the Romanesque cathedral of Anagni, we have this depiction in the crypt of Hippocrates. He's seated here to the right, indicating his medical knowledge to another Greek doctor, Galen. Hippocrates, 4th to 5th century BC. Galen, 2nd century AD, Greek physician who was physician to the imperial family of the emperor Marcus Aurelius, even saving the family from an outbreak of the bubonic plague. He healed them in the 2nd century AD. He also took care of, used wines as disinfectant for taking care of the wounds of the gladiators. He healed their wounds. He used wine in necessary amputations at times, in all kinds of operations performed on gladiators after their battles. He was so esteemed as a physician that Marcus Aurelius declared him to be main sommelier and asked him to select the best wines for his cellars. He created an innovation for the emperor, if you will, Galen. He advised the emperor not to use the thick, sweet, syrupy wines preferred at the Roman banquets. The Romans mixed their wine with water. It was about 2 portions of water to every portion of wine, and instead to look for dry, lighter wines. After Galen introduces this to the cellars of the emperor, lighter, dry wines become preferred actually by the Romans. Last year, quite an amazing discovery in Rome under the Roman Forum, precisely under the Basilica of Massencio. They discovered the remains of the workshop of Galen. This is the place where he stored the herbs and spices from all over the empire that he used for the grindings of his medicine. These medicines often mixed with wine to give them greater power, if you will. This is a place where he did demonstrations of dissection for other young students of medicine who were interested in learning. And he also presented conferences. Also in this area of the workshop of Galen, he stored all his texts on medicine, which he'd written. Huge number of volumes on medicine were stored here. This will be open to the public next year. So on your next trip to Italy, you want to go to the Roman Forum and ask to see the pharmacy of Galen, Roman doctor. Another Greek doctor working in Rome for the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. A Roman, the poet Horatio, said, "In vino veritas, in wine is truth." Well, our rural neighbors are not sure perhaps about wine as the harbinger of truth, but they certainly know about its medicinal uses. I asked Peppa recently to tell me about some of the uses of wine in her family as she was bringing up her children. And she said, "Come on over for lunch and we'll talk about it." So first, before our talk, she served me some of her delicious pasta with her vino rosso, which is off to the left out of the picture on the table. And then she told me how she used medicine to care for her 3 little boys, who are now grown men, of course, with children of their own. And she said, "I'd hold my little baby," and she talked about holding Leonello, her firstborn son. "And when I was going to change him, what would I do? I would warm wine in my mouth." Let me show you this. Pardon me. This is what I want to show you. I would warm wine in my mouth. I would take a sip of wine and swish it all around so that it would be the right temperature to put on his little body. After all, she said this could have been winter. It wouldn't be too hot and too cold. And then she said, I would put him on my lap on a clean rag, because they didn't have things like diapers. They made rags out of ripping old sheets, ripping old rags, which they cleaned very well. She said, I would lay him on my knees and I would lay him on his back and I would dip a clean rag in the warm wine and I would start washing him. I'd start up near his neck. I'd wash his little tummy. I'd wash his little palle, which means his little balls, and then his little pistolino. I won't translate that for you, and all the way down to his knees. And then I would turn him over and wash him on his back. And she said to me, and she was saying this in the photos to the right, very earnestly, after all, Anna, we didn't have the money to have solutions to clean our babies when we were changing their diapers. We didn't have money for creams for them. We rubbed them with olive oil after they were well cleaned. She told me that wine was also used to care for weak little animals. If you're a tenant farmer, every single animal counts. Peppa grew up extremely poor, and they lived from the animals they grew on the land. So she said that her mother, when their baby chicks were weak, the hatched baby chicks, her mother would warm wine in her mouth, spit it onto a spoon, and put that drop of wine into the beaks of the little chick. Now here, Peppa is not putting wine into the beaks of these little chicks. She's just giving them some breadcrumbs. There's some baby chicks that she hatched from a hen, and she was warming them in a used cake box near her wood stove. Our farm neighbor Quinto here on the left told me that when he worked the land and came in from the fields, muscle aches, sweaty, he was advised by his parents, and all the young men did it. They would rub their legs with a rag in wine to take away muscle aches. Alessandro here on the right, delightful Alessandro. He's no longer with us, alas. This photo was taken some years ago. He's in his wine cellar. Alessandro told me that wine and vinegar were both used in his family, and that if he had a headache, his mother would dip a clean rag in vinegar and spread this clean rag in vinegar on his head, and it would take away any headache. So there's a new headache solution. Put away the aspirin and try vinegar on your head. And he said she also used vinegar for mosquito bites, cuts, and so forth. It was a natural disinfectant. Agreeing with what they said, of course, both these gentlemen said, would be our farm neighbor Pepe and his wife Mandina. And as we're talking about the medicinal uses of wine one day in Pepe's wine cellar, what did he have to do but open the tap in the cask and give me a little bit of his wine to taste, his vino rosso. Behind him is a demijohn of his wine. And this is his lovely wife, Gentile, who's no longer well, unfortunately, holding a bottle of their vino rosso. The god of wine for the Greeks was Dionysius, and his cult develops in about the 6th century BC. And in this terracotta frieze, we're seeing him offering a cup of wine to Persephone, goddess of the underground, and also of cultivation. Her symbol is a chaff of wheat, which she's holding. And Dionysus' symbol will be, of course, the grapevine. He has it flung over his shoulder, generous bunches of grapes hanging off it. And he's offering her almost timidly, his eyes are closed here, a cup of his wine. Beautiful work in sculpture by a Greek artist of the 6th century BC. Look at that explanation below. Notice the letters AC, meaning Avanti Christo, before Christ. Look at the transparency of his tunic here, an absolutely exquisite work of art. It is in the Archaeological Museum of Reggio Calabria. Reggio Calabria is the tip of the boot in the region of Calabria, which was part of Greater Greece, Magna Graecia, that whole area of Italy, which was part of Greece in the years before the Roman conquest. The triumph of Dionysus or Bacchus, because by this period he's known as both. This is a mosaic of the 3rd century after Christ, dopo Cristo, which you know as AD, of Sus Tunis. It's a delightful mosaic of the triumph of Dionysus or Bacchus, if you will. The triumph was depicted generally starring a Roman general or an emperor who returned in triumph after the conquest of another people. This is the triumph of Bacchus. Its triumph is as he enters into the town. He's pulled in a chariot. He's on a chariot generally pulled by leopards. In this mosaic, he's pulled by tigers. There is the leopard in the foreground. He seems to be drinking some wine, actually. Next to the chariot is a bacchante, that is a celebrator in the rites of Bacchus playing the tambourine. Now, Ovid always depicted Bacchus in this way. Ovid said that he was a young god, this boy. And in many of the mosaics, he is, and in the Roman depictions in general, he is depicted as young, this god, a boy forever, which is the literal translation of the poet Ovid's description of Bacchus. And this is a mosaic of the Roman villa called Villa Daphne, which is Antiochia, Turkey, of the 2nd century AD, and it's very lovely. It almost seems to be contemporary in its design, doesn't it, in the floor surrounding the Bacchus image. Notice his crown. His crown is actually of ivy leaves, and generally the Romans depicted Bacchus with ivy. Ivy symbolized for them continuity and fidelity. It was a plant sacred to Bacchus. And for this reason, according to the Greeks and Romans, a crown of ivy was worn when one went to a celebration of Bacchus called the Bacchanalia to avoid unwanted effects of unpleasant inebriation. If you wore your crown of ivy, you could save yourself from the effects of too much wine. Here is Bacchus crowned with his ivy in this lovely mosaic of the Roman villa, dedicated to him, called Domus Bacchus, or the House of Bacchus, in Interamnia Teramo, 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. Teramo is in Italy now. It's in the region of Abruzzo. And this is another image of the young Bacchus crowned with his ivy crown, ivy leaves all interwoven. And this is a beautiful mosaic, Roman period, in Algeria, Cherchel, Algeria, probably about the 3rd century AD. This is another depiction of Bacchus in Algeria, in the town of C.E.T, the 3rd century AD. Algeria is an unvisitable area for all of us, even here in Italy. It has been for a long time. And there are just some extraordinary archaeological museums in Algeria that makes one have a tremendous desire to get to that country as soon as possible. Look at this gorgeous floor of a villa of Algeria, 3rd century AD. Again, extremely contemporary in its design. For those of you who heard my lecture on Assisi street art to the grotesque, look at the designs around the center panel. Those are grotesque. And we learned in that lecture that grotesque come from the word as in a grotto. They're mimicking the grotesque designs, mimic the designs which decorated the villa of the Roman Emperor Nero. And these are beautiful grotesque designs surrounding the center panel. Now, I, Donna, just want to move in for a minute on the last figures here. And here we have Bacchus. He's being crowned by a bacchante or perhaps a nymph with his ivory crown, his ivy leaf crown, that is. And his chariot is being pulled by tigers. There's even reliefs on his chariot. This is a tremendous amount of exquisite detail for a mosaic floor. And I'd also invite you to look at the beautiful transparency of the toga of this nymph here to the left of his chariot. So this is a stunning work, Algerian. Bacchus appears in the Thermopolia of Pompeii. A thermopolium was really a coffee bar. In ancient Pompeii, it's where they served wines and where they served foods. Wines were in this vats right here. There were over 100 thermopolia in Pompeii. Pompeii, of course, was buried by ash when Vesuvius exploded its top in 79 AD. But doing excavations, they've even found in some of these thermopolia signs on the walls indicating prices. For one, whatever their coin was, one sign says, for one, whatever it was, a glass of wine. For a good glass of wine. For 8, Falerniana, which was the wine preferred by the emperors. Now, in the background here, you can see on the fresco on the wall, Bacchus is to the right of the central figure, the god of wine, appropriately in the Thermopolia where food and wine was served. And to the left, Mercury, appropriately here as well, because he was the god of commerce. We have Bacchus depicted here in this lovely oil painting in the National Gallery of London by Tiziano Vecelli, whom you probably know as Titian. We all know as Titian, early 16th century, from one of the Greek legends, the Bacchus and Ariadne, that the Romans will call Arianna. The story is that Ariadne was devastated because she was left on the island of Naxos by her lover Theseus. He's sailing away in a sailboat. You can barely see it here off to her left-hand shoulder, and she's devastated. And then in comes this young man, looks at her. They say it's love at first sight. That's going to be Bacchus. He promises to marry her, telling her that when he marries her, he will set aside her wedding diadem, her wedding crown, and after her death, he will fling it to the skies and it will become a constellation. There's the constellation up here in the clouds. And you can see all the people here participating in a joyous celebration of Bacchus. There's a wine flask here. This is probably a little cherub right here, and nymphs playing the tambourines and so forth. And this figure here, who's bearded and seems to have horns like Pan, this could be Silenius, called by the Romans Sileno. He was the assistant to Dionysus. And he was generally depicted as an old man, often quite inebriated. But it's said also that he could predict things. He was very prophetic. And so in the cult of Bacchus and Dionysus, he was always a central figure. That probably is Silenos depicted right here. We have another image of Bacchus here, actually two. I'm going to talk about the one on the right first, by the 17th century painter Guido Reni. And in his Bacco, on the right, we see Bacchus here, and he seems to be a joyous young boy, like the Bacchus that Ovid described as young this god, a boy forever. And he seems to be enjoying his wine. He does not seem to be inebriated. And we have here some of the iconographic depictions of wine, which are often in Renaissance painting. The flask, the wine cup. We have a little cherub here with a beautiful maiolica vase. Look at the shine on that vase, full of wine that he's going to pour out for Bacchus. Bacchus here is crowned not with ivy, but grape leaves and grape leaves and bunches of grapes. And that's how he's generally depicted in Renaissance paintings as well. The little Bacchus on the left is in the Art Museum of Dresden, and he does seem to be a little bit inebriated. He has his crown of grape leaves. He's guzzling the wine. His eyes are thrown back in his head, and he's just blithely peeing, which you can see right here as he leans on a cask. So both of these images of Bacchus by Guido Reni, 17th century. Generally, he was not depicted as inebriated by the Romans, however. There was an exception to the rule. That was during the Bacchanalia. And the Bacchanalia were festivities celebrating Bacchus around the Ides of March, the 15th of March, as of about the 2nd century BC. This is on a sarcophagus, a Roman sarcophagus of the 2nd century AD. And I'd like you to note in the center, Bacchus, and probably that is Ariana with him. And Bacchus is holding his thyrsus. He was generally holding a staff called a thyrsus. And according to Greek tradition and Greek mythology, the thyrsus was a reed or a staff, and it could have been made out of a shaft of the wild fennel plant. And then ivy leaves were bound around it, and sometimes it was topped by a pine cone, but not always. And this thyrsus, which he carried, represented hedonism, pleasure, and enjoyment. And then to the right of Bacchus here, that's probably Silenus, who for Dionysus and also later for the Romans was his assistant, called by the Greeks Silenus, called by the Romans Sileno. The Bacchanalia were especially celebrated with verve and passion, orgiastic rites, ecstasy in Magna Grecia, which is in orange. So this was Greater Greece, right here along Sicily. The heel of the boot, Reggio Calabria. The instep of the boot, the Basilicata, a bit of Puglia, and up here along the southern part of Calabria, Latium. Actually, it probably ends just in the area of Calabria. And the green is the Etruscan area. The red, interestingly, was the area at the time of the 2nd century BC, taken over by the Carthaginians. So this is Carthage here, and this whole part of Sardinia and Corsica, and part of Sicily, too, was in the hands of the Carthaginians. Bacchanalia is depicted here in a beautiful glazed terracotta statuary group in the Capodimonte Museum, which is Naples. Naples is absolutely one of my favorite cities in Italy. There's so much to see there. The Capodimonte Museum is just one of the many joys. This is 19th century glazed terracotta. Here we have the young boy Bacchus in the center. To his right is probably Silenus, because you see there's little horns on his head. So at sometimes he's depicted as a mixture of a faun, as an Faun, a bit of Pan. He's a mixture of many mythological figures, this Silenus. This is a depiction of a Bacchanalia, a celebration, the Bacchanale degli Andrii by Titian. This is 16th century, and you can see it's in the Prado Museum in Madrid. And you can see all the elements of the Bacchanalia. Lust, pleasure. Look at this woman in the front, beautiful body. She's in the position depicted especially in Renaissance paintings of sleeping. Another sleeping figure is up on the hill. That's probably Silenus, who's just had a little bit too much wine. This little boy is blissfully peeing right into the river, which we can't see here. And this river actually is the river of Andros, the island of Andros. It said due to Bacchus's intervention there, the river turns to wine. But no greater depiction, of course, of Bacchus than Caravaggio, 1598, late 16th century. Here he is depicted as a young little boy, very much like Ovid's description of him, young god, like a boy, and rosy cheeks. He's had a little bit of wine. He's certainly not inebriated. His body is beautiful. Muscles are shown here. He's wearing the traditional crown of grape branches and grape leaves. And it is said that maybe this should be appropriately called a young boy dressed as Bacchus, because no doubt for this painting, Caravaggio used one of his favorite young models as the as the Bacchus, a young model of whom he was very fond. And also Bacchus was commissioned by one of his great patrons, Cardinale del Monte, a Roman cardinal called Del Monte, and it's known that he very much favored the pleasure of young little boys. And here, this Bacchus doesn't seem to be eager at all to put his tunic back on. It's gently dropped off his shoulder, if you will. Under the glass of wine is a fruit bowl, and in the fruit bowl is a pomegranate, symbol of fertility. It's full of seeds, and a rotten apple, the Vanitas theme. really carpe diem, live life, because the pleasures of today will soon be gone tomorrow. Here we have the glass of Bacchus, a close-up of it. Absolutely beautiful is the depiction of the transparency of the glass. You can see the sleeve of Bacchus through the glass, the palm of his hand. Look at the transparency of the wine in the glass. Now, in the Wine Museum of Torgiano, on the right, we can see it, is a copy of the glass of Bacchus. This is actually late 20th century, but it's a copy of a 17th century glass, because as of the 17th century, glass blowers in Venice often were making copies of the Bacchus glass. Bacchus is depicted in the Wine Museum. Also in this painting, I believe this is watercolor by Renato Guttuso, great Palermo, Sicily artist. This is contemporary 1990. Those of you who saw my talk, a culinary mosaic, street food of Sicily, a culinary mosaic, will remember that Renato Guttuso did that stupendous painting of the Vucceria, the outdoor market of Palermo. It's one of his most famous paintings. I also used that image in my talk, which was called Art to the Table. And both those are on my website now. This is my 11th Zoom talk. And this Monday will be up on my website on the virtual experiences page. And if you have a sleepless night, there's a lot of other ones up there. There's about 10 of them. This is the Wine Museum, the exterior. It's a 17th century palace in the little hill town of Torgiano, south of Perugia. And in this wine museum are, I think about 2,000 objects associated with the culture and history of wine from 3000 BC. It is an absolutely extraordinary museum not to miss when you're next in Umbria, in the little hill town of Torgiano, which was a fortified castle as of the Middle Ages, 12th century, built on the site of a pre-existing Roman town that was destroyed by the Goths in their invasion of the 6th century AD. Around the town of Torgiano are the wonderful Lungarotti vineyards. They've been cultivating wines for over 50 years. They've developed the first DOC wine in Umbria, the Rubesco. And I think they developed that. It was maybe in the 1960s. And the wine label on that bottle is depicted here, or an arrow indicates it here. It is on the fountain of Perugia, this late 13th century masterpiece of the Pisanos. And on this fountain, in the panels are depicted all the agricultural tasks of the year. This fountain was also mentioned in my lecture, Art to the Table, Food and Wine, I think, and Art to the Table. And you see here the month of September. This is the figure which is on their wine bottle, bringing in the grapes. Here the grapes are being pressed. The month of October, the wine is transferred to a bigger cask, and the cooper repairs the wine casks. All done in Carrara marble, not to miss, right in the center of the city of Perugia. And here is the delightful Signora Lungarotti. She is responsible for the wine museum. She started collecting objects associated with a cult of wine. In about 1964, the Wine Museum opens in 1974. Here she's looking at one of her favorite possessions in the collection, and I want to show it to you right here. It is an extremely lovely Maiolica flask of the Orazio Fontana workshop of Urbino. This is 16th century. Maiolica is twice fired pottery. It is painted before it is fired for the second time. And Urbino becomes a center of Maiolica production and painting as of the 16th century, because as of 1508, the area is given to the Dukes of Urbino, and they control all the area of the Marches region where Urbino is, as well as part of Umbria. Gumbio is part of the dukedom of Urbino in this period of time, 16th century. Now, when you enter the Wine Museum, the first things you see are the sarcophagus sarcophagi, I should say. These are burial urns for cremated Etruscans. They date from the first, second century BC. We were there, just this photo is taken recently. So there's masked Pino, my husband. And here Pino is looking at one of the urns. This is from the first to second century BC. It is a funerary urn. And what is depicted on the front of it, but two servants carrying an amphora of wine, probably to a banquet, the banquet that will celebrate the person whose ashes are in this sarcophagus, because the Etruscans celebrated birth, life, death with wines, always. Now, in the next room, as you go in to the left, you will see some of the most ancient objects in the museum, and to the right, a display of amphores, I think we call them, which are wine jugs, first to second century AD. And the drawing behind it shows how they were set into the hull of a ship for shipment throughout the Middle East so that they couldn't break during shipment. In the display to the left, we see the first two objects are the oldest in the museum. These are wine jugs of 3000 BC to 3200 BC, actually, the display said, from the Cyclades area of Greece, because those Cyclades islands were the passing point for the trade and the shipping and so forth of wine in that area of the Middle East during the this period. 3000 BC all the way up to about the 3rd century AD. Also in the display are exquisite Etruscan vases and wine flasks used by the Etruscans. This here is a drinking cup in the shape of a bull's head. That's called a rhyton. Here on the right, we see some beautiful bucado work. And this is a stunning piece of bucado right here. Etruscan bucado calyx, which is a drinking cup of the 1st century BC. And bucado is gray clay fired in an oxygen reduction atmosphere until the clay becomes black. And it has a metallic sheen to it. And the bucado was often called the poor man's silver. This is a bucado calyx in that Etruscan fresco, which I had showed you previously, of Tarquinia, 5th BC, in an Etruscan tomb, representing a dance, probably in celebration of the deceased, wishing them swift passage on to the next life and happiness in their future life. And let us remember that the tombs were to be their homes forever. This is a beautiful Etruscan calyx, and this is probably one of the most important ones in the museum. And this is a calyx called of the two big eyes, the Due Occhioni. It's of the 6th century BC, and it is of the area of Etruria, which is now Latium. This is the town of Vulci. And the two eyes probably represent eyes which will keep away evil, keep away bad luck, bring good luck to the drinker out of this calyx. This calyx was probably used for the sharing of wine during the symposium. The plural of the symposium would be the symposia. These were events that took place after a banquet. Only men were present. They would move to the part of the house where they were going to have their symposium, which is a meeting of gentlemen after a meal. The word comes from the Greek meaning to drink together. And sharing wine after the banquet, they would enjoy each other's pleasure, perhaps music, dance. The symposium might be celebrating the awarding of some sort of victory in an athletic competition, in a poetic competition, in a theatrical competition. And the Romans will call the symposium the convivium, from which we get the word convivial. The convivium, however, was a little bit more raucous than the Greek symposium, and a little bit more wine was shared. Inside this calyx, probably shared by many at a symposium, and just think of it, from 6000 BC, at how many wonderful banquets was this calyx, was the wine shared. Inside this calyx is the head of a gorgone. Gorgone comes, the Italian comes through the Latin, through the Greek. Gorgos means terrible. This was the head of a gorgone, probably. The gorgoni were one of three monsters that appeared in Greek mythology. And this could either be a gorgone or it could be a theatrical mass. And the idea of this in the calyx would probably be, it would be there to scare away evil and thus protect the drinker of the wine, which is in the calyx. In the wine museum, besides the Etruscan works, we have some beautiful Roman works. I'd like to mention right here that the Greeks drank their wine from beautifully painted cups, calyx, and so forth. The Romans drank their wine from glassware. And here we see a depiction on the left of two fine pieces of Roman glassware. We have this glass bottle of the 3rd century AD and a Roman glass goblet of the 6th century AD. On the right is a marble hand with grapes, an extraordinary piece in the Wine Museum. It's thought to be of a sculpture that was done between the 3rd and 1st century BC. The plaque behind is in terracotta, and that's from the 1st century AD. This was also used for drinking by the Romans. It's called a patera. This is a drinking cup, 1st century AD, in opaque molded glass. So this was formed by molding the glass before the common use of blowing glass. And on the wall, right near the glass, we can see the depiction of the chart or the graphic, which shows us how the amphorae were fit into the ships so that they did not break during shipment. The amphorae could hold about 9 gallons, even more, of wine. They were sealed with a cork and then cement and fitted into the ship. Now, what was very interesting for me was to look at the display of the different tops and necks of these amphorae, because the explanation there told us, the graphics there told us that one could determine, the archaeologists can determine the provenance, where that amphora came from, depending on the shape of the neck. And they would be different according to if they were made in the Cyclades Islands, in Etruria, in present-day Turkey, would be Anatolia, etc. And here are examples of the different forms of the amphorae, much more elongated here, wider here, longer neck here. And I was very, very intrigued by these for a specific reason. I looked at this amphora and I said, it's like the one I have. Now, what does that mean? In 1976, an amazing August, I was the guest of a Greek family on the island of Lesbos, often called by the Italians Mytilene. Look at how close it is to Turkey. And I was the guest of the family of Maria Zervou. She hardly spoke any English. I spoke very remedial Greek. I picked it up on a couple summers in Corfu. I'd met her in Corfu the summer before, and she wanted me to come to her house the following summer. And I got off the got off the ferry, got on the bus, went up this road. It was gravel then, bounced my way up on this old bus to Mandamados, which is her village. The family greeted me. We stayed there a couple days, and then they sort of made me understand that I should pack my things because we were going somewhere. I packed my things and went out of the house one morning, and there was a donkey there. They loaded all of our possessions onto the donkey. We followed the donkey walking. I think this was all dirt then, about 40 minutes, and we went out to this little cove right here. And there was one little house, and it was theirs. And they had all their olive groves around here, and I think their father kept goats or sheep. And at night, we'd take a walk to another house, which I guess was up here, about 20 minutes, to visit their friends. They were all talking in Greek. I really had no idea what they were saying. And we would swim every day in this cove. It was extraordinary because we'd swim with snorkel and mask. And at the bottom, we'd see all these necks of broken ceramic. And Maria's brother sort of explained to me, and I don't know how, in simple school English, that centuries ago, a ship must have gone down in bad weather transporting wine to Turkey. And he said to me, Anna, let's go down. Basically, saying this in Greek, let's go down and try to get a couple pieces. Well, you really couldn't because these urns were filled with sand. But I was able to get two pieces, two tops of two amphorae. They're sitting in front of our fireplace right here on the right. Nobody notices them, but I know how precious they are. And there they are. And I found these at the bottom of the sea near Mandamados on Lesbos in 1976. And they were part of a shipment of wine. In the next room, after you see the wine shipment, you learn about the cultivation of the wine in Umbria over, let's say, the last 200 years. And I've circled here with the help of Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. We have circles around these trees, which are called the mother of the grapevine, La Madre dell'Uva. And you've met these trees if you heard my lecture, Umbrian Rural Life Revisited. And many of the people in Umbria for years, centuries ago, they didn't even have vineyards. They weren't able to cultivate them. They didn't have enough land on which to cultivate them. So they planted these European maple trees at certain distances in the field so that they could plow wheat, oats, and barley up the rows between the European maple trees. And the European maple trees guided up the grapevine. And that is where they got their grapes. Our neighbors call these the Madre dell'Uva. They're often called also, the vine is called La Vita Maritata, the vine which is married, because she is married to the tree. Let's see, right here. And this is a Vita Maritata being guided up the mother, which is the European maple in front of our house. And this was about 2 weeks ago when we picked our grapes. There's some of the grapes, and there is the European maple, and this is the grapevine growing up. These were planted by the farmer who built this house. It was a ruin when we moved in, as many of you will know if you saw the photos in my past lecture. And this was the grapevine which Gianetto planted, and it's been there since at least 1926. And here I am picking some of our grapes, and right behind me is another European maple guiding this grapevine. The grapevine comes out this wire here, and that's the whole, and this is coming from another tree. They're meeting each other in the middle. And in the wine museum, you can see someone in the photos up here, you can see them pruning these European maples here. And notice the basket, which I've indicated in the middle. This is a basket of willow. And near every vineyard, every row of European maple trees and mothers of the grapevine, the farmers would plant a willow tree, because they would then prune the willow tree, and in the winter, sitting around the fire, they would weave the baskets, which would be used to pick the grapes at the grape harvest and pick their olives. Let me see here. And this is one of our Madre dell'Uva, the mother of the grapevine. This is the grapevine, which is married to that tree. And there is the willow tree right near them, which Gianetto planted. And I think oftentimes when I see that willow tree, I just think of him years ago, stripping the branches down, drying them a bit, and in the winter, sitting near the fireplace in the old farmhouse, weaving his baskets. And this is the farmhouse in the background in 1976. And this is our farm neighbor, Pepe, who came up to help us pick grapes with his wife, Mandina. And he's holding his grape picking shears, which are also displayed in the wine museum, the kind of shears they used. I don't think in this photo, Pepe had hanging on his waist an oxen horn. He did have one, but I don't think he was using it that day. And you could see it in this photo. The farmers would take a horn from one of their oxen, they could put a hole in it, and then they would tie it to their belt, and they would put the pruning shears in it as they picked the grapes. So it was their pruning shear holder, if you will. And there's Pepe and Mandina about to take the grapes on their oxen-drawn cart back to their farmhouse where they had the wine press, and they pressed the wine for us. And they're off and about to leave. This is picking grapes just about 2 weeks ago, and we're using the same grape picking shears. We don't have many grapes this year, only about 8 crates, but I think we'll probably get something over 50 liters, and they're in our cellar now downstairs. And we did not put them in a destemmer called a diraspatrice. They were taken off, the grapes were plucked off the bunches by two young helpers who are from Estonia. There's Osvaldo and Stella right here. And we did not have a destemmer. This is a destemmer of a winery. This machine is the one used to take the grapes off the stem so that they can then be pressed. This is a destemmer called diraspatrice, which literally means taking off the stalk. And this is about 100 years old. It's displayed in the Wine Museum. And there it is right here. And it's displayed under this wine press, this horizontal wine press of the 17th, 18th century, which was used in Gubbio till 1973. That is one oak tree. It's about 50 feet long. And this is a horizontal wine press. It's called a catone, named after Cato, Roman agronomist who first described it in about this, it was 2nd or 3rd century BC. So it is operated by two men. They are going to push this screw around, and down at the other end of the wine press are big blocks of wood, which are lowered, and they're going to be pushing on the cask of wine, and the wine will go right into the channel. And this is the wine press again, a photo of the museum with the diraspatrice on the right, the destemmer, and on the left, the olla. These are terracotta jugs. This is an old one, about 200 years old. Romans used them as well in which to age the wine. This is a vertical press, and the vertical presses were first described by Pliny the Elder, Plinio, the Italians called him, in the 1st century AD. He was the same historian who described the eruption of Vesuvius, actually, Plinio. So vertical wine press. We use a vertical wine press for our grapes, but it's a small one. And it's a wine press typically used to make vin santo, or the holy wine. Vin santo is made by drying grapes, which are high in sugar, such as the Malvasia, the Pecorino, until they become raisins. And then they're pressed at Christmas and drunk at Easter, holy times of the year. The wine that is produced is therefore called holy wine. And in the Wine Museum, there are two small presses for the production of the holy wine. These are Vin Santo presses, very small presses. These are called caratelli, little casks for the storing of the holy wine. This is another farm friend who lives near Deruta. Some of you may have been to lunch with me at Giuseppa's house. She's a highlight of my Perugia Deruta tour. We're in her stall some years ago. This photo was taken because we just visited her, and they don't have a good supply of the grapes this year for the Vin Santo. She's not making Vin Santo this year. So these will be dried almost till they're raisins, and then they'll be pressed at Easter, and the wine is then drunk, pressed at Christmas time. The wine is then drunk at Easter. In the Wine Museum, there's a beautiful orcha. This is a Vin Santo wine jug with grotesque motifs. It's Tuscan of the 16th century AD. We talked about grotesque in my talk on Assisi street art, to the grotesque. And the grotesque imitate the paintings on the walls of the Roman Emperor Nero, which when they were discovered in the 15th century, people thought were painted in a grotto, hence grotesque. And we didn't have any Vin Santo this year, but we shared a bottle, Pino and I, just to celebrate having finished making our own table wine. He's dipping the tozzetto in the Vin Santo. Tozzetto means little chunk in Tuscany. The cookies to dip in the Vin Santo are called cantucci. And we have tasted our new wine, but it is now only grape juice. I have some right actually near me, and it won't really become wine until November, but this is the gesture for it's delicious. Yeah, I think it's going to be very promising Pinot. This is a vertical wine press, which is in the Wine Museum of the 18th century. And I want to point out here the monogram of Bernard of Siena, who preached through the area in the 15th century. IHS, Jesus Hominum Salvatorem, is how he always started his sermons, talking about Jesus Christ, Savior of mankind, with an IHS on a wooden plaque. This is actually a Christogram of the 3rd century AD, depiction of, or it's an inscription indicating that the person about to give a talk or preach a sermon will be speaking about Christ as the Savior of mankind. That is on a picture in the Wine Museum, that symbol, the wine jug of the 17th century. This plate in the Wine Museum of the 16th century is of Deruta Maiolica Historiata, means it tells a story. It's a friar praying before a wine cast. It looks like he's praying for good wine. It's coming out into a pitcher. And the friar here, this could be a self-portrait of the artist. His nickname was El Frate. He wasn't a friar at all. And they said that he did this just after he'd heard of Bernard of Siena preaching through Umbria in the 15th century, drawing in the crowds, and he thought it was extremely comical. So in a way, he's making fun of the preaching of a Franciscan here. And look at the picture. That is beautiful lusterware. And here are 2 Deruta lusterware pictures of the 16th century AD. Lusterware is made by doing a 3rd firing on the ceramics. This is after you've fired once, out comes terracotta. Paint it, fire it again, out comes maiolica. Add a metallic glaze as a 3rd firing, and out comes beautiful lusterware. This is a delightful plate in the Wine Museum, which I enjoy seeing. It's in a Tuscan plate. It's a footed plate. It has a bottom to it. It was Maiolica, the 17th century, this tipsy woman. She's enjoyed her wine too much. You can see her breasts actually coming out of her dress. In the Wine Museum, there are many, many religious objects also, because there's a whole display of wine in the religious cult. And this is one of the finest pieces. This is a polychromatic terracotta bust. We don't know who the artist was, of Pope Urban I. He was a 3rd century martyr saint. This bust was done in the 18th century. He seems to be cradling the grapes appropriately enough. He's invoked by wine growers of northern Italy, the Alto Adige region. They always pray to him at the times of their wine harvest. These delightful cups are called baby se puoi pitchers, drink if you can cups. And they're part of a display which is called Wine and Enjoyment, Wine and Pleasure, Wine and Socialization in the museum. And you have to figure out how to drink out of these cups. The one on the right is very precious. It's 16th century Venetian blown glass. It actually was in France. The French courts commissioned a Venetian glassblower to make this. And they're trick vases. There's a little hole right under the handle. If you seal the hole, you are able to drink the wine. You're creating a vacuum. This one here is another drink if you can pitcher, and you have to figure out for yourself how you're going to drink out of this. They're all trick pitchers. There are flasks there of various shapes. This is an 18th century Maiolica shoe-shaped flask from Ariano Irpino, which is in Campania. This is a pilgrim's fish-shaped Maiolica flask of Calabria, 19th century. During their walks to Rossana Calabro, to the church where there is a venerated image called La Madonna dei Poveri, the Madonna of the Poor. It is a wooden statue of the 10th century, said to be the oldest wooden statue of the Madonna in Italy. And the pilgrims going to that church for her festivities would carry flasks in the shape of a fish. These also are from Calabria. We're talking about the toe of the boot. They're called babaluti, and they're Calabrian wine flasks. which were often depicted in grotesque forms, grotesque shapes, comical shapes, shapes from the theater, personages from the theater. Babaluti means a penitent. And these were the flasks carried by the penitents who would walk to the place to which they were making the pilgrimage, not with shoes on, but with heavy woolen socks, and screaming out, requesting forgiveness for their sins as they went. And their flasks and their backpacks were shaped like these Babaluti flasks. These flasks are ring-shaped flasks. They're also called ciambelle. This one in Calabria is the 19th century on the left. Seminara is very noted for its ceramics and englobed, not englobed terracotta, pardon me, but engobed terracotta, meaning terracotta with another clay put on top of it, which could be formed. And these were carried by women into the fields. They were ring shaped, so they could carry them on their arms. And it said men never drank out of the wine here because terrible things could happen to them. They could even be guilty of crime. These were women's flasks. This is a Maiolica ring-shaped flask on the right of Ariano Arpino, which is in the region of Campania. This is a zoomorphic ring-shaped flask. Engobed ceramics, graffito, which means scratched in, so another layer can come out. Engobed is putting a clay surface on top and working with that before painting. And this is from the area of Emilia-Romagna, 16th to 17th century. Another stunning piece in the Wine Museum is the anthropomorphic terracotta wine jug, Northern Italy. This is a mermaid, both sides. The mermaid symbolized lust and sexuality, and she was commonly depicted in medieval and Renaissance ceramics and art. Now, one of the last sections of the Wine Museum ceramics has the selection of ceramics in greens and whites, and these were generally the colors used in ceramics in the Viterbo area, the Deruta area in the 13th, 14th century. Reds and blues are going to come into ceramics later, about the 15th, 16th century, and the yellows are going to be using cobalt for blue. But in this period, these pieces are all from the 12th, 13th. The primary colors were green and white. Now, notice behind the ceramics, the graphic here, this is a photograph of the Cathedral of Foligno's main doorway. And the doorway is in cosmatesque mosaic work. And that same cosmatesque mosaic work is decorating the Cathedral of Orvieto, the main doorway. The Cosmati brothers worked in Rome, and they were a group of 7 artists. They worked for 4 generations, and their cosmatesque work was done by fitting small mosaic pieces together into the stone to create these stunning works. Cosmatesque work is named after the Cosmati brothers. They're working in the 12th, 13th century. And this is the facade of the Cathedral of Orvieto, cosmatesque here on the door, but also in all the sculptures on the facade intertwining grapevines. So the grapes, the vines appear in art everywhere. And right here on the right is a picture which was done between 1250, it's thought, and about 1270. It was the symbol of the Wine Museum for years. And this is the picture. I don't know if you can see it. We have a copy of it right here. It's one of my favorite things. This is a wine pitcher. Wine pitchers have long beaks. Water pitchers have shorter beaks, if you will. These are wine pitchers, long beaks. This is called a bazella in Umbria. These are more bazelle here. And here I am in our house with my Vazella, the big one, which is a copy of the one in Deruta, which I just showed you. And I'm standing under a beautiful painting by my brother Tom. And he painted a picture that my mother gave to him, and it was from Deruta. This is not a wine pitcher. This is a water pitcher. This does not have the long beak. This is not a vasella. Near that is another painting of my brother Tom, and there's a vasella. And this too was a gift from my mother to, I guess, to my brother. No, it was a gift, excuse me. Both of these were gifts from Pino and myself to my mother. And now I think Tom has that, and that's one of his beautiful paintings. Just to wrap up, I want to mention the pharmaceutical section of the Wine Museum. It's absolutely extraordinary. And there are pharmaceutical jars from the 12th to the 16th century AD. We've talked about the importance of wine in medicine. And the pharmacists, the apothecaries guild developed in the 13th century. And the pharmacists become an important part of the medical field. There are pharmacists or apothecaries, there are surgeons, and there are the simple doctors who take care of general medical needs. And since the painters of the apothecary jars knew that the apothecary jars would be seen by many, and in display cases, they gave extreme attention to the decorative art of the apothecary jars. It's absolutely extraordinary. And in the Wine Museum, of course, there is a copy of Galen's Texas. This is translated from the Latin, and this is a 16th century copy of the medicinal cures and so forth of that Greek doctor, Galen, who cared for Marcus Aurelius. And before you leave the museum, you'll pass the extraordinary lusterware of Mastro Giorgio Andreoli of Gubbio, 16th century. And this is called The Infancy of Bacchus. He seems to be feeding grapes to Silenus, probably, who was his teacher. And Silenus here has a red pitcher. And this is extraordinary lusterware. Mastro Giorgio was so famous that the Dukes of Urbino made him an honorary citizen of Gubbio, and they exempted him for 20 years from taxes. But after that Duke died, the following Duke said, you can be exempted for taxes from life, so as extraordinary as your work. Mastro Giorgio invented the technique of lusterware. He dissolved metallic filings, copper, gold, silver into the final glaze. His work was so extraordinary and the luster sheen so exquisite that nobody was ever able to imitate it. The secret died out with his sons. Others have tried. And this is lusterware, early 20th century, done by Alfredo Santarelli of Gualdo Tadino, which is near Gubbio. It's lusterware maiolica, a plate in a wine goblet, but as you can see, nothing like the sheen that Mastro Giorgio can create. This is not lusterware. This is simply maiolica. This is a delightful 16th, 17th century plate from the area of Venice, and it is showing the triumph of Bacchus. He's arriving on the carriage. There's a little cherub helping to pull the carriage with satires, and the Bacchante, the celebrators of Bacchus, wearing, of course, in their hair here, the grapes and grapevine wreaths rather than the ivy wreath. And this is Venus and Bacchus. This is a maiolica footed plate from an artist called, we don't know who he was, the Mastro of Urbino, 16th century. Again, this is maiolica, so doubled fired pottery, but without the final luster glaze. One of the masterpieces, which is in the Wine Museum, is this Girolamo della Robbia, 16th century. This is the tin glazed ceramics invented by Luca della Robbia, and the secret is passed on to his nephew, his sons, and so forth. And his workshop was extremely successful in Florence in the 16th century, della Robbia. This is a Bacchus who looks rather horrific, and it's over a door. It's 19th century, over a door of the entrance to a museum in Orvieto, the Museo del Duomo. Now, if you want to have an enjoyable Bacchus, just go to the Wine Festival of Montefalco, end of September, It is called Montefalco Enologica, the celebration of wine. And here you have Bacchus on one of the floats with his Ariana. She's serving him quite a lot of wine. The whole city comes out to celebrate wine at the end of September. It's a most enjoyable festival. And these vineyards around Montefalco are above all producing the great Sagrantino wine. This is an indigenous grape. It can only be cultivated in about 1,000 acres of land around Montefalco, Beivagna, Giano dell'Umbria, and the Sagrantino wine is now considered one of the top 5 reds of the entire country. Until the 1960s, the Sagrantino grapes were dried until they became very sweet grapes. They were pressed until they were almost raisins. They were used in a kind of sweet wine. They were always used in mass wine, hence the name of the grape, the sacred grape, Sacro. Sagrantino. And in the 1960s, the Caprai family decided this grape can be very well used in a table grape. Since the mid 1960s, it is now used in a table grape, and it is celebrated in a table wine, and it is celebrated in full glory and fervor in Montefalco. And here you see the town of Montefalco, beautiful hill town, medieval hill town, at the end of September. This town is called the Balcony of Umbria, and you can see why. From all sides of Montefalco, you have splendid views of the Sagrantino vineyards. And I think here you can, let me see, here's Montefalco. And here you can see one of the vineyards. It's right behind me. This is about a month ago. I went up to see the Antonelli vineyard and the winery, had a tour of the winery. They're great producers of the Sagrantino grapes. And of course, I had to buy a bottle of their wine for Pinot. I actually didn't buy the Sagrantino. I bought Montefalco Rosso. Montefalco Rosso has the Sagrantino grape, the Merlot grape, and the Sangiovese. He prefers it to the Sagrantino. This is a very tannic grape, which lends itself very well to long aging. The Sagrantino will get nice and develop a wonderful flavor when it's about 10 to 15 years old. And there you can see the Sagrantino vineyards, Montefalco behind on the hill, and some of the floats during the procession celebrating the Sagrantino wine, end of September. So put that on your list next year. If things open up, you want to be in Umbria for the end of September, give me a call. We'll go together to the wine festival. It's absolutely delightful. There's all these floats representing different aspects of the grape harvest. This guy is playing his accordion. His float is decorated. See the basket up there for the gathering of wines along the float. Along the top of it, they created wine trellises. These people are singing, and their shirts should be the color of the Sagrantino grape, another accordion player, big grapes up here, the baskets down there for the picking of grapes. They're singing songs about the joy and pleasure of the harvesting of the grapes. Really, this is a little Bacchanalia, if you will. You know what else is the Bacchanalia, a celebration of Bacchus, which I didn't mention? Mardi Gras. It's that same time. Venice's Carnevale. Those are the pre-Lenten festivals when you celebrate with joy and fervor and madness, if you will. I think they're basically, no, I don't think, I know they are. They're basically derivatives of the Bacchanalia festivals of early springtime, March. On one float, there were gentlemen up there at the table drinking wine, playing cards. There they are. I said, enjoy. They raised their glasses to me, salute. They're definitely drinking Sagrantino wine there. This is one of the streets of Montefalco. And that day, wherever you went, you were offered a taste of wine or even the Sagrantino ice cream. Nothing like it, the gelato di Sagrantino. Textiles, the town is known for its textiles, many of them depicting the grape motif were displayed that day. And then you went into the cloister of the Sant'Agostino Church. And then was the time to start your wine tastings. I think you paid €3 or €4. You were given a little red pouch. It's the color of the Sagrantino wine, your wine goblet. In you went to the cloister, and you could wander stand to stand. Hold on, drinking wine. You can see Pino and a friend of Julia's enjoying wine on the left. And they have their little pouches which say Enologica, wine week, and there's all the tasting of the Sagrantino in this 13th century cloister. And if you wanted to have a little bit of a prosciutto sandwich, so you weren't drinking wine and not eating anything, there was a gentleman there offering prosciutto, and his son next to him was enjoying Sagrantino as they made their prosciutto sandwiches. Now, we enjoyed it last year. Pino enjoyed it with Alessio, and I enjoyed it with this wonderful group of young people, all raising their glasses, all saying salute. And you know what was delightful to me as a fellow American, like many of you? All day long, people enjoying wine, tasting wine. The motto of the wine festival is bere lento. That's on all the posters. Drink slowly. Was there ever anyone that I saw tipsy or who had imbibed too much? Never, because wine is to be sipped, enjoyed with your friends, savored, drunk slowly, and above all, shared with pleasure. Salute, buonanotte, and thank you very much for joining in.